I'm 78 years old, and I don't have many illusions left about myself. Most mornings are quiet now. Too quiet. The kind of quiet.
It gives you space to think about things you spent a lifetime avoiding. I didn't plan to tell this story, but at this age, the truth has a way of surfacing, whether you invite it or not. And one truth has been sitting with me for years now, heavier than I expected. Being right costs me more than I ever imagined. I don't say that with drama. I say it with a kind of tired clarity, the sort that comes when most of the people who could argue with you are gone, and the ones who remain don't bother anymore. I live alone. My wife passed 6 years ago. We had been married for 49 years. That number sounds solid, impressive, even, but numbers don't tell you how a marriage feels near the end. They don't tell you how silence can grow between two people who once talked late into the night, or how habits can replace tenderness without either person noticing when it happened. I spend a lot of time sitting by the window. I watch people walk their dogs. I watch couples argue quietly on the sidewalk, their heads tilted away from each other. I see young men tapping at their phones while their children try to get their attention. I don't judge them. Not anymore. I recognize myself in them. For most of my life, I thought being right was a virtue. I was raised that way. My father believed that the world respected men who stood their ground. He wasn't unkind, but he was firm. If you challenged him, you'd better be prepared to lose. And usually, you did. I learned early that there was safety in certainty. That if you knew the answer, if you could explain yourself clearly, you wouldn't be ignored. You wouldn't be weak. So I learned how to argue. Not loudly, not cruelly, just persistently. Calm logic, facts, memory sharpened into a tool. In my 20s, that skill felt like intelligence. In my 30s, it felt like leadership. By my 40s, it felt like identity. I was the one people came to when they needed clarity. Or at least, that's what I told myself. I worked in operations for a manufacturing company. Nothing glamorous. Long hours, schedules, deadlines, problems that needed fixing. I was good at it, not because I loved it, but because it rewarded the way my mind worked. There was usually a correct answer, and I usually found it at home. I carried the same habits without realizing it. Conversations felt like discussions. Discussions felt like debates, and debates had outcomes, winners and losers. I didn't think of it that way at the time. I thought I was being reasonable. My wife used to say, "You don't have to correct everything." She said it gently, at first, almost playfully. I laughed it off. I told her I was just being honest. That accuracy mattered. That words mattered. What I didn't understand then was that tone matters too. Timing matters. And sometimes, the need to be understood can suffocate the need to be loved. We had 2 children, a son and a daughter. They were different in the way siblings often are. My son was cautious, thoughtful. My daughter was emotional, quick to react, quick to forgive. I connected more icily with my son. Or so I thought. When my daughter was in high school, she came home upset one afternoon. I don't remember the exact reason now. Something about a friend, or a teacher, or maybe a boy. She was crying. I remember standing in the kitchen, listening, nodding. Then I told her what she should have done differently. I explained where her reasoning went wrong, how the situation could have been avoided. I was calm, logical, precise. She stopped crying. She just looked at me. Then she went to her room and closed the door. At the time, I felt relieved. I thought I had helped. Years later, I realized she hadn't needed an answer. She needed permission to feel what she felt without being corrected. That pattern repeated itself in small ways. Over dinner, in the car, during holidays. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't insult anyone. I simply explained, clarified, fixed, and slowly. Conversations shortened. Stories became summaries. Opinions were shared carefully, or not at all. I told myself it was normal. Teenagers pull away. Couples settle into routines. People get busy. I told myself a lot of things. In my 50s, my wife started spending more time with her sister. Weekend trips, long phone calls in the other room. I didn't mind. Or at least, I said I didn't. It gave me more time to work, to read, to enjoy the quiet. Looking back, I think she was finding spaces where she didn't feel evaluated, where she could speak without interruption, where being understood didn't require precision. We argued occasionally about money, about plans, about decisions. The arguments were never explosive. They were measured, controlled. I stayed calm. I always stayed calm. She used to cry during those arguments. That confused me. I wasn't yelling. I wasn't being unfair. I was making sense. Once, during an argument about moving closer to her sister, she said, "You always have to win." I told her it wasn't about winning. It was about reality. She didn't respond. She just shook her head. That gesture stayed with me longer than any words. By the time I retired at 65, the house felt large. Too large. The children were grown. My son called every few weeks. My daughter less often. When she did call, the conversations were polite, careful. We talked about the weather, about work, about neutral things. I noticed she never asked for my opinion anymore at first. I thought that meant she had grown confident, independent. Later, I understood it meant she had learned what it cost to disagree with me. The turning point didn't come all at once. It never does. It arrived in pieces. My wife got sick, not suddenly. Slowly, a diagnosis that sounded manageable at first. Treatments, appointments, a calendar full of hope and caution. I went with her to every appointment. I asked questions. I took notes. I researched options. I wanted to make sure we made the right choices. One afternoon, after a long day at the hospital, she said she was tired of talking about it. She wanted to rest. I told her we needed to decide about the next steps. She closed her eyes and said, very quietly, "Can you just sit with me without fixing anything?" I didn't know how to answer that. I sat there, yes, but my mind was still working, planning, evaluating, being right. She died 8 months later. At the funeral, people told me she had been kind, bet she listened well, that she made them feel at ease. I thanked them. I nodded. I don't think anyone would say those things about me. That realization didn't come with tears. It came with a dull weight, a settling, like dust after something breaks out. In the years since, I've replayed conversations in my head, not the big fights, the small ones, the corrections, the explanations that weren't asked for, the moments where I chose clarity over closeness. I can see now how being right became a habit, and how habits, repeated long enough, become walls. I don't know if I could have changed earlier. I like to think I could have, but I also know how convincing my reasons felt at the time. This is the first time I've said these things out loud, or at least, the first time I've said them without defending myself. And I'm saying them now because there isn't much time left to pretend they don't matter. After my wife died, the house didn't just become quiet. It became revealing. There was no one left to interrupt me, no one to disagree with me, no one to challenge my version of events. For the first time in my life, I was always right. And there was no comfort in it at all. Grief does strange things to time. Days stretch. Memories collapse into each other. I found myself thinking less about the end and more about the middle. The ordinary years. The years I assumed didn't need attention because they weren't dramatic. I would sit at the kitchen table, the same one where I'd explained things so many times, and I'd remember small moments. My wife starting a sentence and stopping halfway through. My daughter changing the subject. My son nodding instead of responding. At the time, I thought that meant agreement. Now I understand it often meant surrender. People checked on me after the funeral. Neighbors, old colleagues, family. The calls came regularly at first, then less often. I didn't mind. I told myself I preferred solitude. I had always enjoyed my own company, but solitude is different when it's chosen than when it's what's left. One afternoon, about a year after my wife passed, my daughter came to visit. It was the first time she'd been in the house since the funeral. She stood in the doorway for a moment, looking around, like she was stepping into a museum of her childhood. We sat in the living room. We talked about her work, her children, save things. I wanted to ask more. I wanted to know how she was really doing. But I didn't trust myself not to turn it into a discussion. So I stayed quiet at one point. She mentioned a decision she and her husband had made about moving. I disagreed. Instinctively, immediately, I started to explain why I thought it was a mistake. She listened politely. Then she said, "This is why I don't talk to you about my life." She didn't say it angrily. She said it calmly, almost kindly. That hurt more than anger would have. I tried to respond. I tried to explain myself. Old habits don't disappear just because you see them clearly. But she shook her head and said, "Dad, I know you think you're helping, but it feels like I'm always on trial." On trial. That phrase stayed with me. After she left, I sat there for a long time. I realized that even when I tried to be careful, my instinct was still to correct, to analyze, to improve. I had spent so many years equating love with guidance that I didn't know how to offer one without the other. My son visited less often. When he did, our conversations were brief, respectful, distant. We talked about repairs around the house, about sports, about things that didn't require vulnerability. I wanted to ask him why he seemed so reserved around me, but I was afraid of the answer, afraid it would confirm what I was beginning to see too clearly. Loneliness in old age isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It arrives quietly, disguised as routine. Days structured around errands, meals, television. You don't notice how little you're needed until no one calls to ask your opinion anymore. Ironically, that's when I finally learned to keep it to myself. I think back to moments when things could have gone differently. Not dramatically, just slightly. If I had paused before responding, if I had asked a question instead of making a point, if I had let silence exist without filling it. But time doesn't work that way. You don't get to edit conversations once the people in them are gone. There's a particular kind of regret that comes from realizing you weren't cruel, just closed. That you didn't intend harm, but you didn't prevent it either. That you were present physically, but absent emotionally. I don't blame my younger self entirely. He was doing what he thought was right. He believed that clarity was kindness, that honesty was enough. What he didn't understand was that people don't remember how accurate you were. They remember how safe they felt with you. I see that now in the way people talk about my wife. The stories they tell aren't about her advice. They're about how she listened, how she made space. I wish I'd have learned that earlier. Not because it would have made me happier, necessarily, but because it might have made others feel less alone around me. If you're listening to this and you're younger than I am, I won't tell you what to do. I don't have the right anymore. I'll just tell you what I wish I had known. There are moments when being right matters. Truly, decisions with real consequences. Safety, integrity. Those things aren't trivial. But most of life isn't made up of those moments. Most of life happens in kitchens and cars and quiet evenings. It happens in half-finished sentences and feelings people don't yet understand themselves. In those moments, being right can be a kind of distance. You don't have to agree with everyone. You don't have to abandon your values. But sometimes, the cost of proving your point is higher than you realize. Sometimes, the person across from you isn't asking to be tattooed. They're asking to be seen. I learned that too late to save my marriage the way it once was. Too late to be the father my children needed when they were still learning who they were. Too late to rebuild certain bridges. All I can do now is live with that knowledge, carry it quietly, share it when asked. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't even expect understanding. This isn't about redemption. It's about honesty. I don't have many years left. I feel that in my bones. In the way mornings take longer. In the way memories surface uninvited. If this story meant something to you, if it stirred something uncomfortable or familiar, that's enough. You don't need to change your life overnight. You don't need to make promises to yourself. Just notice the next time you feel the urge to correct someone you love. Notice it. Sit with it for a moment. See what happens if you let it pass. As for me, I'll keep sitting by the window, watching people pass, wondering how many of them believe, like I once did, that being right is the same as being close. It isn't, and that's a truth I finally understand, now that there's very little left to argue about.